Right, hello everybody. Obviously some of you know me, um, and some of you have obviously been at my workshops before. Um, so we're doing ghosts. I'm on a bit of a mission to bring back different types of ghosts, because I feel like certain types get all the glory, if as it were, and I think that there's some pretty cool ghosts like lurking in folklore that we can be inspired by. Um, so, what is this workshop, you might be wondering? Sam did allude to it before. Um, and that's just the blurb that I think I may or may not have put as the description. But it is basically this idea that there are different types of ghosts available, um, and we should really be using them, quite frankly. I have said that they're notable across Britain. I know the first one that we're going to have a look at definitely appears in Germany as well. Um, the second one appears in Ireland, and the third one is a smaller one, so we'll see. Anyway, I'll crack on. We're going to look at three of them. The less I blather at the beginning, the more writing time you get. So the way I've set it up is I'm going to tell you a couple of tales, or at least one for each of the three types of ghosts, and then you will have a little bit of time to generate some ideas. You might not get much done in the time, depending on how long I talk for, but I'll try and give you a fair whack of time to write down whatever's swirling around in your head immediately. Um, but then after we've done all three, you'll have a much longer period of time. I think it's about 25 minutes this morning, which gives you time to work on the piece that grabbed you most. And the general reason why is because it's very hard to make time to write, isn't it? I every day I'm like, I must get some writing done when I've finished everything else, and then whenever I finish everything else, something else comes in, and I end up not having time. So this way. I've said you have no choice, as if I'm kind of like pinning you all down and forcing you to write. But at least it just means that you've set aside this time for writing and creativity and what have you. Um, it may well be that you end up not actually wanting to write anything creative, and actually you're like, do you know what? I want to go and research that more later. That's fine as well. I do have blog posts for each of the three types of ghosts. So obviously, if you need names or place names or anything like that, they're already in those. Um, I'm aware I don't always have the easiest accent to listen to, so apologies in advance. Um, but as I say, at least the information is there. So first things first, let's have a look at the treasure hunting ghost. And I am hugely biased with quite a lot of the ghost stories that I like to share. They do end up being from the Northeast because, as you might gather, that's where I'm from. And I was having this conversation with someone yesterday that I always think, oh, everyone knows this story, and then I tell it on the podcast, which is Fabulous Folklore, in case anyone's not familiar with it. And then people are like, oh, I'd never heard that before. So I forget that just because it's familiar to me doesn't mean it's familiar to everyone else. So the first treasure hunting ghost we're going to have a look at. Treasure hunting's actually not necessarily the right term. It's more treasure providing ghost, but treasure hunting sounds better. So we're going to start off with Mega Meldon, otherwise known as Margaret Selby, and she was likely born in 1570. I think this painting of her can be found in Seton Delville Hall, for anybody who's up here and familiar with our many, many stately homes and castles and what have you. She also has links with Wallington Hall as well. Very quickly, just for who she was basically a landlord. She owned a lot of property, but she acquired it through, I won't say devious means, but basically she exploited a lot of legal loopholes to seize land and property. So, for example, she would suddenly say, right, you have to pay off your mortgage by this date, and it was far too early and somebody wouldn't be able to do it, so she would seize the land, things like that. If she'd been a man, she would have been lauded as a business genius. I mean, it's still a bit of an awful thing to do one way or the other, but it's one of the reasons why I suspect people used to mutter that she was actually dabbling in witchcraft. I mean, you could argue a lot of financial stuff is a form of witchcraft, but the accusations never actually amounted to anything. It was just disgruntled neighbours having a bit of a moan. I can only imagine what the Facebook group would have looked like in Melbourne if there had been such a thing. Um, so she was a bit of a miser in life, is the best way to describe her. And then she was buried at Newminster Abbey near Morpeth in Northumberland. Except this is where the ghost bit comes in because she doesn't seem to have stayed there. So people started to see a beautiful woman flitting around the graveyard in a burial shroud shortly after her funeral. Now, I'm not casting any aspersions on her whatsoever, but if that painting was accurate, she's not necessarily what you would expect when someone said beautiful woman, I think. Um, but there we go, that's what people reported seeing. They also saw a phantom black dog on Meldon Bridge, and people thought that both the dog and the beautiful woman were Meg back from beyond the grave, and she might scare passers-by on the bridge, because how else are you going to pass eternity? And basically, the woman and the dog were seen around both Meldon and Hartington for 7 years and then just stopped. And the locals were like, great, awesome, she's gone. And then she came back 7 years later. And the locals were like, we said she was a witch. So she must have wandered the earth for 7 years and then she'll rest for 7 years and then she'll come back and thus the cycle will repeat. They thought that was her punishment for witchcraft, which is weird because I've literally never come across that in any other record of what people thought happened to witches, but this is what they said. But the reason she walked all these different places, and this is obviously important for our purposes, is she was supposed to frequent the places where she'd hidden treasure. And one of the things that's really weird is she left all of her property to her son, but no actual cash. And she would always pay bills with physical money, so she clearly had some, but there was no physical wealth and not even a bank account after she died. So everyone's like, oh, where did the money go? She must have hidden it somewhere. So this is where people thought that she'd have hidden the treasure across Northumberland, and then she would abandon a location if anyone found the treasure. And there were a few individuals who suddenly got wealthy, apparently out of nowhere. So people thought, ah, you must have found one of Meg's hoards. And there also people thought that the reason why she disappeared was because all of her treasure had been found. And she did apparently spend a lot of time guarding a well near Meldon Tower. And people thought that there was a bull hide full of gold hidden in this particular well. And one man decided he was going to retrieve it. And he was told to go to the tower alone on a certain night at midnight, which is like the folkloric time of day that nearly everything happens. And he was told he would meet someone there, and together they would find the gold. And he had one condition, and one condition only, and he had to remain silent at all times in order for this to work. And like I said this morning, I would already be knackered at that point. But anyway, I digress. The man turned up at midnight, encountered his assistant for the evening, and he was using grappling hooks and a chain, got himself down the well, and lo and behold, it was empty of water because it had run dry years before, but he found the hide with gold. So he's like, aha, the story was true. Got the chain around it, started to climb back out of the well. And the assistant was obviously at the top, giving him a hand. And just as the man grabbed the bag to haul it to safety, he cried out, we have her now. And presumably it was all just a bit too exciting for him. But the hooks and the chain disappeared, the bag fell into the well, never found again. And the man's assistant even changed, and some versions of the legend claim he actually became Meg herself. And basically, the fortune that he would have had he not spoken, apparently would have meant he was set for life. And a lot of people are like, hang on a minute, Meg was really miserly in life. Why would she just start like randomly handing her money out after death? But there is this sense in folklore that you cannot rest as a ghost if you have unfinished business, and hidden treasure that hasn't been found is unfinished business. Um, so basically, this idea of then a ghost helping someone to find treasure as long as they're silent at the time that they find it. Obviously, they can talk after they found it, but that appears all through folklore. You get it in quite a lot of stories when people go dowsing, and you also get it when they try and make pacts with spirits to go looking for treasure. But that's a different talk for another time because that is a weird thing to do in and of itself. My favourite part about the whole story is the fact that there was actually a schoolhouse in Meldon that apparently she owned and ran, and she'd hidden some treasure in the roof, as you do. And in the early 19th century, the ceiling apparently collapsed because there was so much treasure, the ceiling just couldn't hold the weight. And the master wasn't in the room at the time, so you can only imagine what a bunch of school kids suddenly getting rained on by gold coins would have made of all of that. And what's really interesting is anyone who's ever run into any Northeast history will probably have come across M.A. Richardson in his table book. Apparently, one of his friends was there at the time and actually managed to grab two or three coins. So that was quite an interesting little twist there, that there is evidence that the raining treasure at least did actually happen. But I also wanted to bring in the fact, just before I let you have a crack at some writing about this, that there is a reason there is now a calf on screen, because there's a legend from Westmoreland, which is on the other side of the north part of the country, involving Hackthorpe Hall, and it had become a farmhouse by the early 19th century. And there was a tenant farmer working there one day, and a spectral calf appeared to him and led him to a stone cattle trough. And underneath, he actually found a cache of hidden gold that was enough to pay for two estates. Now, clearly, this had nothing to do with Megan Meldon, it's a separate story. It's unclear why a calf would be a guardian of gold. I suspect that just the guardian of the treasure took the form of a calf, because obviously the farmer would be familiar with that and therefore more likely to follow it. Or it was trying to be as unthreatening as possible. And I mean, look at it. Calves are just such cute animals. You couldn't be threatened by a calf. But anyway, let's have a look at some common points of these treasure hunting stories. So, ghosts don't always need to be humans. I love spectral animals. So there's a calf in this one. Obviously, Meg sometimes takes the form of a black dog. Who's to say that they could take other forms as well? So that cat that randomly turns up at your house might be trying to lead you somewhere. You never know. The ghost will do two things generally. They will either physically point to the location of the treasure, which you get in some of the Welsh ones. The ghost just appears and like points at where the treasure is. Or sometimes they just kind of loiter. So you get this where treasure's been buried under staircases, which seems like really inconvenient. And there's a story from South Shields where a ghost goes through a wall at a particular spot, and when the woman who's living there actually takes up the windowsill, she finds stuff underneath it. So they're usually, through their proximity to the treasure, you can figure out where it is. It's not like Challenge Annika where you've got to solve clues or anything. They're usually fairly explicit. Only someone who's brave enough to actually accompany the ghost or follow their curiosity will actually be rewarded with treasure. So the farmer who goes with the calf finds the treasure. The guy who followed these random sort of instructions would have found the treasure if he hadn't spoken. So there is a degree of somebody being willing to take a risk in order to then be rewarded with treasure. You might say foolhardy, but we'll say brave at the moment. And the retrieval absolutely has to be done in silence, or the treasure will be lost and the seeker will never find the location again. This is something that comes up in folklore multiple times, uh, often to do with King Arthur, where if you find where he's asleep, where he's caught hiding, you won't find the entrance again if you get the ritual wrong that you have to do to wake him up. Kind of feel like someone needs to get on finding him again, but that's a side issue. The silence bit is really important though. Um, it just won't work if you chat on. I'm assuming once you've actually got it in your hands and you're away from the location, like I say, you can chat as much as you want, but the actual retrieval bit, you've got to keep stum. So these are your prompts before you have a go at writing some of this yourself. So your questions to ask: whose treasure is it? It's quite useful to know that. Is it legitimate treasure or is it ill-gotten gains? That might depend whose it is and what form it takes. Obviously, some might be legitimate that someone just didn't trust banks and hid stuff. Um, so again, worth having a think. What kind of treasure is it? Obviously, don't forget, one man's trash is another man's treasure. So it might well be that it's valuable to one person, but not for another. Where is it hidden? That's obviously quite important to the story. Who guards it and why? So obviously, again, this brings us back to the spectral calf. Why would a spectral calf guard it? There is one story of treasure supposedly hidden beneath Tynemouth Priory, which is supposed to be guarded by like an army of skeletons and dragons, that Walter the Bold gets past, if you believe the story. How do the Guardians reveal its location? Is it as simple as appearing and pointing, or do they have to lead someone to it? You can work that bit out yourself. And who comes to liberate it? The who is quite important, I think, for whether they succeed or not. So it's worth bearing all of that in mind. So basically, it's 7:24. I gave 7 minutes this morning for this one. So that would take you to 7:31. So I'll give you 7 minutes to come up with some brainstorming around that. And obviously, if you don't get finished, don't worry. You can always come back to it later on. Um, Sort of once we get to the bit at the end. But yeah, so you've got, well, actually, you've got until 7:32 now because I waffled too much there. So you've got until 7:32. So hopefully that was helpful in sort of some form. As I say, if you haven't managed to finish anything, that's fine. You can always come back to it later. Oh, it's like I'm being back at work again. Uh, it's just very different from my actual day job where I teach because you know you are listening. So that's always quite nice. Um, anyway, the next topic, and I must admit this is my favorite. I know I shouldn't have favorites, but I totally do. And this is oh, they're phantom coaches. And like I said this morning, this image is not AI. This is what happens when I find vintage photos and get a bit bored with Photoshop. It's literally just Gaussian blur applied many, many times to the coach. Because as you might imagine, there's not that many photographs of phantom coaches on Wikimedia Commons, so I kind of had to make my own. But there we go. So yeah, actual photograph. I want to say it's in London, but it doesn't really matter because we're looking at phantom coaches. And they're really common in stories from the 18th and 19th centuries for one very simple reason. That's when people were using them. So, you know, but obviously stories do tend to reflect what people see. Generally speaking, there's a sort of a bit of a thread that you can follow through where there's like a local landowner riding around at night in a black carriage. He's often got black horses pulling it, which may be fire breathing or headless, which is quite impressive. And he might also have black dogs running alongside just for extra visual impact, which just makes me think that if that is indeed the case, there's a lot of local landowners were really secretly a bit of a goth. But there we go. The stories are quite interesting in the fact that the coach itself, what it means and does, varies depending on the story. So sometimes they're ill omens, and family members try to avoid seeing them because if they do, it'll bring death to the door. That's some of the ones that you get in Ireland. You also have phantom coachmen who just terrorize pedestrians with merry abandon. So I can't wait to see one of those on these dash cam footage programs. And then other ones act as anniversary markers when there's been deaths or disasters. The disasters one is usually involving the coach itself, whereas the anniversary for deaths is usually the occupant of said coach. So speaking of which, one of the more famous ones is Anne Boleyn, and she's supposed to drive down Blickling Parks Avenue in her coach once a year. And that's in Norfolk, if anyone was wondering. She holds her head in her lap, because I suppose where else would you hold it? And her horses and attendants are also headless as well, just to really drive home that point. This particular one acts as an anniversary sighting because I think it's on the date that she was executed, and it's also a reminder of what happened to her. I can't help thinking that that one might have been put about a little bit by the Boleyn family, but there we go. Her father's also sometimes seen in, it might be in the same area in his own coach, and again, headless, just to again make the point. The next one's quite an interesting one because this particular coach, and this isn't the actual coach, I just wanted to give you something to look at, but it gives you an idea of the kind of thing we're talking about. This one's associated with Bungay Castle again in Norfolk, and witnesses either see it or they hear it, but you don't see and hear it, which is quite an interesting one. So the coach will roar forth on a particular day of the year. The horses will breathe fire and smoke pours from their nostrils, and people sometimes hear it rumbling down the hill. And obviously, it's a typical thing. It grows louder and then gets fainter, so they can sort of tell when it's past. Other times people see it go past but don't hear anything, and I can't help thinking that one would be more freaky if you could see a coach, particularly because the horse's hooves are sort of striking sparks on the ground, but the whole thing's entirely silent, like the whole thing's on mute. That would be really weird to see. I almost think that would be worse than hearing something I can't see. I mean, I'm short-sighted, so that happens a lot of the time anyway, but sort of seeing something I can't hear is a bit more unusual. So it's quite a fascinating one that you've got two completely different sets of witnesses who are they encountering the same coach? We don't even know because you don't hear and see the thing, you know what I mean? It's a very odd one. Um, Elsewhere though, because there's not really much else I can say about that other than the fact that there are witnesses, which is fascinating. Actually seeing the coach can sometimes be an omen that someone will die, not necessarily with the Bungay Castle one, but just in other stories. And never ever accept a lift from a phantom coach. That will spell your doom, which I think is just a good extension on not accepting lifts from strangers, quite frankly. And the other one but there's two stories, but this one I absolutely love, and this is the Coach of Bones, which is my new band name on Dartmoor. And according to local folklore, Lady Howard murdered all four of her husbands and now must carry out a penance for her evil deeds. The penance itself is a little bit odd, but basically, she has to travel in a carriage built from the bones of her four husbands. The carriage itself is then driven by four headless horses and a headless coachman, and a huge black dog runs along beside it. And then every night, the group leaves Fitt's house near Tavistock and then travels to Oakhampton, so it goes across Dartmoor, where she has to then pluck a single blade of grass, like from the castle mound. Once she's done that, she then has to go all the way back to Fitt's house again, and she's got to repeat that until she's completely cleared the castle mound of grass. To give you an idea, that is said castle mound. As you can see, it's still quite grassy, so it might take her a while. But this kind of weird penance is something you see quite a lot where people have to like what's the word? Like they braid a rope out of sand, or they've got to do these impossible tasks that you just can't do, and it'll never be finished, and that's kind of part of the actual punishment. And if the coach made of bone stops at any houses along the route, those occupants would die, and anyone who stopped the coach on the road would die. And witnesses have actually reported hearing the rattling of a coach as it approaches along the road. They've heard the thundering of hooves. Sometimes people have seen a huge black dog with red eyes. And then other people have said that they've actually seen a ghostly white woman sitting in the back of the carriage. And apparently the coach leaves the scent of rotting meat in its wake. So this one adds scent to the senses that accompany this particular one. Um, there is a walk around Oakhampton Castle called Lady Howard's Walk, which is believed to be named for the route that she takes to pluck the grass. However, I don't like misinformation, so it is worth pointing out she was actually well respected in her lifetime. She did lose her first three husbands in really weird ways, but she divorced her fourth one, so there was no murdering people left, right, and centre. So, if that's the case, and there is a coach of bones, who's actually riding in it if it's not Lady Howard? Which there's a prompt for you straight away. And the final story I want to tell you, because this gives you an anniversary of the disaster, and this is the Phantom Coach pub in Coventry, named for a local legend because in the 19th century a coach disappeared one night in the area, and people believed that the coach ended up in the nearby marsh and then sank without a trace. There is actually a theory as well that they drained the pond into which the coach crashed and then built the pub on the site, which apparently activated the haunting. Um, but basically in the legend, the coachman was driving the horses too hard, and that was what led to the crash. So people say that they still hear thundering hooves and coach wheels on the road on dark nights. And one witness as recently as 2018 saw a stagecoach with its men wearing top hats, which is quite cool. No photo of it, unfortunately, but I thought it was quite interesting that I say 2018, like, oh, that's only a couple of years ago. That's like 8 years ago, but still, in the grander scheme of things, relatively recent. What is interesting about this one, though, is it's not just an anniversary disaster, it's also an omen as well, because a couple who lived nearby in the 40s heard the sound of horses galloping past the house at midnight, looked out, saw nothing, mentioned it to one of their neighbours a couple of days later, and they were like, "Ooh, that's a bad omen." And the Coventry Blitz began a few months later. Now, if the Coventry Blitz had begun the next night, I would have probably bought into that one, but it just shows how these coaches can do multiple things at the same time. So there can be an anniversary disaster and an omen of doom, and just generally something that you want to try and avoid where possible. So what are my come on, Google Slides, behave. So what are the common points? And I love this image from the LSE library. Um, the local landowner riding round at night in a black carriage pulled by fire-breathing or headless horses, never both, because that would be difficult. I suppose it would depend where they're breathing fire from, but that's a different mental image for a different talk. Some coaches act as ill omens, other ones are anniversary markers. So, like, or like that one in Coventry can be both. Um, Phantom coaches can be heard if not seen. In some ways, I think they're easier to add to a story if they are heard. Because that idea of like an impending rumbling and then it dying away is kind of creepier. But then at the same time, we've got that completely silent vision from Norfolk, which is also deeply weird. And never accept a lift from a phantom coach. As I said in this morning's class, what happens if a phantom hitchhiker accepts a lift from a phantom coach? That is a story I am going to write, just so you know, but I just thought, that would be quite. I've got such a baby bonnet about phantom hitchhikers, it's not even funny. And they might be fibs told by smugglers. There are some, again, in Cornwall and Devon, I think it is, where there's a very strong possibility that smugglers put the story about of these phantom coaches that were like an omen of doom if you saw them. So people would stay at home, and then thus the smugglers could do their activities and be ne'er-do-wells, and never, no one would see. So there's nothing to say that the story has to be true for you to then rely on it, is all I'm saying. And there is a story of somebody painting their horses white apart from their heads. So in the darkness they would look like headless horses, and they weren't. They were just black horses painted partially white. So um, as if criminals would lie, you know what I mean? But anyway, there's some questions to ask, and that would have been amazing to have seen that in Poldark, but never mind. What type of phantom coach are we talking about? Is it an omen of doom? Is it a cursed occupant? Is it both? You can make so there's obviously you can make stuff up beyond that. It doesn't have to be just those two things. You can absolutely go to town with this one. What actually happens if it's heard or seen? Is it more just something that adds to the weird like thing of an area? Pluckley's apparently got one, although I think that one was actually made up, but it just adds to how weird and haunted Pluckley in Kent is supposed to be. Um, so or does something bad happen to whoever hears or sees it? Does it only appear on certain dates? Which obviously is quite useful for the anniversary one, so it can be a good reminder of something bad that's happened in the past, even if it's just to the occupant. Does it mark an anniversary? Doesn't always have to. Is it pulled by horses? Because don't forget, this is your story. You can just do what you want with this one. Um, is it pulled by horses? And if so, what type? Are they headless? Do they breathe fire? Is there something else about them? I sort of always think of the almost like the ones in Christmas Carol, the Jim Carrey one where they're just these giant black horses with like red steaming eyes and everything, and I just think they're cool. Um, and does it carry any insignia to actually tell you who's in the coach? So is it like completely featureless, or is there something about it that tells you whose coach it is? Is it made of bones, for example? Um, so again, you can absolutely go to town with that one. And who drives it, if anyone? So in some ways, I almost feel like a coach without a coachman is kind of weirder. But has it got a headless horseman? Has it got a fire-breathing coachman? That would be cool. Um, Again, can experiment with that. It could even be that the occupant is actually also the driver, which I think we see in the film Stardust. But I may have misremembered that. But anyway, I will give you, as it's 7:45, I'll give you another 7 minutes on this one because the last one's a shorter one. So I'll give you 7 minutes on this one. So we'll come back at 7:52. Look at me doing maths. Uh, so hopefully you had fun with Phantom Coaches. Um, that's a weird sentence you don't get to say very often. And our final one, there's a lot less for this one, so that's why it might seem a bit rushed, but that's just because I had more to talk about than I thought I did. Our final one is the Prophecy Ghost, and They're not as common as the other two. I think the most common of all of these is probably the phantom coaches, but these are still quite an interesting one to play with. And this particular story ties back to treasure hunting ghosts at the beginning. And for the particular story that we're going to have a look at for this one, we're off to East Denton Hall in Newcastle, which is it was built in 1622 by a coal mining magnate, and it is one of our few examples of a Jacobean house. And at one point, it was actually owned by the Catholic Church, which is quite an interesting one. And basically, it's rumored to have been haunted by a Silky, and that's Silky, not Selkie, not seal person, Silky. And they're so named because they're ghosts who announce their presence through sound, that of rustling silk. You don't tend to find them outside of Northumberland, I must admit. But I actually have like a whole podcast episode on Silky, so that's something you can have a look into if you're interested. But I need this particular image because a young woman was staying at the hall in the early 19th century, not quite sure when, and she'd gone to a ball at Newcastle's old assembly rooms at the bottom of Westgate Road, and she'd met a young man that she liked. And when she got back to the hall, went to her room, started getting ready for bed, and found an old woman in a satin gown. That is a weird thing, again, to put into Google Images. And she found, they say, this woman sitting in her room, and the woman offered a warning that the young woman wouldn't be quite so happy if she knew what was in her future. So the young woman was like, that's not brilliant. And she also realised that she couldn't see the old woman reflected in the mirror, at which point the old woman vanished. And then the younger woman heard the rustling of silk. One would have expected satin, but never mind, across the room, and then footsteps heading to the door. And then when the girl went to the door, she found it was still locked, just as she'd left it, but the old woman had gone completely. Obviously, as you might imagine, the young woman's like, I'm going to go and sleep in another room, thanks, and never sleeps in that room again, never sees the old woman again. And it does look like she married the young man, but we don't know if the old woman's warning came true or not. What's really interesting about this, though, is the clear, sort of concise, what's the word I'm looking for? Just the way she puts the prophecy across, I think, is the bit that sort of makes this story stand out. What is really interesting with the Silky, though, which may or may not have been this old woman offering her advice, is the fact that she abruptly just disappears. And some people thought that she might have been a ghost because some of the stories is actually more of a fairy type figure. But with this particular ghost theory, the idea was that she'd hidden some treasure somewhere and died and then couldn't move on until someone had found the treasure. But then they'd found the treasure and that's why she'd disappeared. And there was a house in Black Heddon, which is again in Northumberland, and a female servant was just doing whatever she was doing in this particular room when the ceiling gave in and she sort of ran out screaming. So her mistress came in to find out what was going on, and they found a calf skin full of gold among the wreckage of the ceiling. So people wondered if that had been actually Silky's treasure, and once it had been found, then she could move on, and that's why she wasn't seen again. She did actually visit another old woman on her deathbed after all of this happened. So it could well be that Silky just moved because she's quite mischievous, so she may have done that. But the reason why I find all this really interesting is very much that sense of Silky then just offering prophecies, because this particular Silky that haunted East Denton Hall would actually leave flowers for the women who owned it in like the 1920s and stuff like that. So she seems quite protective over the people who lived there if they treated her properly. So is that why she offered the prophecy? Who knows? But the common points with the prophecy ghosts, as I said, there's not that many of them, but from the ones that I have come across, the let's be honest, the prophecy is a bit vague. It doesn't really give you enough to actually go on. It just gives you enough to be a bit doubtful about what you're going to do. But the witness has no idea who they are, so they don't really have any reason to comply. I mean, the very fact that this woman's clearly just vanished out of her own room might have been reason enough, but, you know, never mind. The prophecy, however, differs from an omen because omens tend to be where something has happened and you've got to interpret the signs accordingly. Whereas in this one, the woman's like, yeah, I can see what's coming. It's not good. It's obviously clear dialogue, it's in words, it's something that the reader can understand, the listener can understand, and the characters can all understand. So it's very, very different. There's not, you've got to interpret what the words mean, but ultimately it's still the passage of information from one person to another. So the questions that you can ask yourself, because I want to give you some time on idea generation with this one, before you get some time to do a bit of writing, is who sees the prophecy issue and ghost? Where are they and when are they? When do they see the ghost? What era is it? All those kind of lovely questions. But also, I think it's that sense of if you see a figure like that late at night when you come back from a ball, would you trust your own senses? Who is the ghost is obviously probably one of the more important questions. Are they an ancestor of the person, which would explain why they're given on the prophecy? Have they encountered the likes of somebody before? And again, they're sort of wanting to warn someone so that the same thing doesn't happen to them. You can think about all that lovely stuff. What's the warning? I mean, you could tie it in with the treasure hunting one and, avoid some dodgy business dealings. It doesn't have to be a romance related one. But what is the warning that's passed on? What will happen if the witness ignores it? There has to be some kind of um high stakes, I think, for it to really work. If they just sort of go, oh, it'll rain tomorrow, and it has to have some kind of weight behind it. And does the witness get any further information from another source to corroborate the warning, or do they get that further information when it's actually too late? It depends how tragic you want to go with this one, I guess. And does the ghost appear again? So do they appear repeatedly to give their warning, or is it a one and done kind of thing? So all of those questions that you can ask yourself. Um, it's 7:59. I'll just give you 5 minutes on this one because I want you to have obviously time to work on the other one. So if we come back at 8:04, I think that should work. So that is the three sets of ghosts. Um, Obviously, as to the discussion in the chat about whether silk does or does not make a noise, I'm not going to argue with the folklore. That is the way that Silky is described and has been in a lot of the records. So um, make of that what you will. But it is now your turn to have a decent chunk of time to work on whichever of those three stories most tickled your fancy, as it were. It's entirely possible that actually all three of them will work together. You may find that the three completely different things. It's entirely up to you. Um, and I like to think of this as like this is proper introvert type stuff where like you're writing together but on your own. Because let's be honest, like that's why we're writers and we're not musicians. Um, so choose your favorite idea from the three or more. You might have generated more. I honestly don't know that you've generated during this particular workshop, and then work on it some more. You've got about 25 minutes. In fact, yeah, it will be about 25 minutes. So it's up to you what you want to do with it. Someone wrote a flash fiction this morning, if that helps. You can turn it into a longer piece. You can generate ideas for how it might end. If you've come up with a character, you might actually go, hang on, they'll fit in with a work in progress. It may fit into something wider that you're doing. It may just be something that you want to play with some words for a while. It's entirely up to you. But yeah, so you've basically got, what time is it now? It is 8:05. I've only got like literally one slide after this, so we can sort of go to like 8:30 and then I'll do my little minute and then that's me done. So you've got 25 minutes to have fun with whatever you came up with. Um, I hope I didn't give everyone a fright by suddenly going, hello. Obviously, there's some really good ideas in the chat, so I'm liking to see the directions that you're taking these in. Like I said at the beginning, I do think that these three types of stories have largely been forgotten. Um, and I think that there's quite a lot of life left in them, if that's not a weird thing to say about ghosts. So there we go. Yeah, Silky, I'm an absolute stan for Silky, so yeah, I think she's brilliant. It was so funny when I got in touch with English Heritage and I was like, so you know the Silky that you had on your land? The email exchange I had with them was rather interesting. But anyway, I do have one final slide, and I can't. Oh, there it is. I lost my mouse there. That was weird. Your next steps. And I do realise that this photo of like ghostly women does make it look like they're dancing, which goes quite well with next steps. Um, if you haven't come up with a full story first time, that's fine. You have sort of had a couple of batches of like 7 minutes and then 25 at the end. Like that's actually in the grander scheme of things not that much time. If you have come up with a full story, great. You've now got something that you can then sit down and write. Because a lot of the time, I think procrastination tends to come from the fact that you don't know what to write. Now you do. Hurrah. Um, you can always build on fragments. I tend to keep mine in a folder. And occasionally I'll be stuck on something I'm working on and be like, hang on a minute, the ideal thing that will solve this plot point is in there. And I'll find something that I've already come up with, which can, I'm big on recycling. What can I say? Um, you can always just leave it to rest and then decide later what form the story will take. Sometimes you think, oh, it'll be a short story, and then you end up with a novella, and so on and so forth. You might end up writing a screenplay, you never know. If you do want to let me know what you come up with later on, obviously I do exist most places on the internet, but the best two places to find me are Instagram or Blue Sky. Um, I do respond to emails as well, but it's just generally quicker to grab us on one of them if you're on them. So you can, on both of them, it's just Icy Sedgwick. And yes, Sedgwick only has 8 letters. Please don't put an additional E in there because it won't reach me. And you can be more than welcome to let us know how you get on. Or if you suddenly think of a question and can't remember something, or you want to read the links to the other two blog posts I've got on Mega Meldon and Phantom Coaches, obviously I'm happy to send them. Or you can just use the search bar on my blog. It's all the same. So yeah, that's sort of the end of my bit really. So I hope that people have found that um, helpful and find this sort of format useful as well. But yeah, that's basically the end from me.